the angel of the Lord. And we're looking this time at Hezekiah. Isaiah will be involved also. So the interaction that we're looking at, it's found in Second Kings, and it deals with, excuse me, Hezekiah and Isaiah as Assyria approaches Jerusalem, intending to capture and destroy her. Uh, Earlier, quite a few years earlier, Assyria had taken down the northern kingdom, called Israel, or the northern kingdom, or Ephraim, or Samaria, lots of names used. And they had taken out of uh, the northern kingdom. Most of the Jews sent them to Assyria and sent replacements back in who were Gentiles, who eventually ended up with a sort of Judaism, but they were considered half-breeds by the Jews in the New Testament. So, anyhow, that's where we are. There's a new king around in Assyria, and he's wanting to capture Judah and do to Judah exactly what was done to the northern kingdom. Judah, of course, being the name associated with the southern kingdom, it consisted of Judah and Benjamin, but Benjamin was a small tribe, so Judah is the name typically used. So we're going to look in Second Kings, where you'll find all of this in chapters 17 through 19. And it's a description of a confrontation between Assyria and Judah, as I just mentioned. Assyria had already taken down Israel, as I also mentioned, just repeating myself here a bit. But let me read to you something from Second Kings 17, starting in verse 24. Matter of fact, that's the only verse I'll read here, I reckon. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria. This is that exchange that was talking about, in place of the sons of Israel. So these uh, imports by the Assyrian government, they possessed Samaria and lived in its Samaria cities. As usual, God had warned both the north and the south prior to that, back in verses 13 and 14 of Second Kings 17. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. Verse 14, however, that's both Israel and Judah, did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers who had done, who did not believe in the Lord Yahweh their God. So the consequences for disobedience, disbelief, and idolatry hit Samaria first. In verse 18 of 2 Kings 17 says, So the Lord was very angry with Israel, that's the northern kingdom, removed them from his sight, and none was left except the tribe of Judah. This was the point at which the northern kingdom ceased to be a kingdom and has never been a kingdom since this exile that was forced on them by the Assyrians. God told them there was going to be severe consequences. He told them how to get around the problem. They didn't listen. They did their own thing. This was their payment. The northern kingdom simply has never existed since. Judah still existed as an independent nation. So the northern kingdom was gone. It was under Assyrian control, but the southern kingdom was still independent. Just a thought. If the Israelites were taken out of Samaria, how did Samaria have a form of Judaism in Jesus' day? Remember, the first incident we have was where Jesus talked to the woman at the well in Samaria, and they knew something of Judaism. In fact, as I recall, they wanted the first 5 books only. And again, let me point out to you why their Judaism was a sort of Judaism. I'm going to look at verses 28 and 29 of 2 Kings 17. Verse 28, so one of the priests whom that's the Samaritans, had carried away into exile from Samaria, came and lived at Bethel. In other words, one of these priests that was taken away was returned by the Assyrians to Bethel and taught them, that's the imported Sumerians now, how they should fear the Lord. But every nation, and here's the problem, this priest taught them about Judaism, but verse 29 says, but every nation, and that's those represented by the immigrants, still made gods of its own and put them in the houses of the high places. In other words, the high places that used to be for idol worship are again places of idol worship, but mixed with Judaism, which the people of Samaria had made these high places, every nation in their cities in which they lived. But now Hezekiah, who was king of Judah, the southern kingdom, was a bit different. At one point in Hezekiah's reign, he had rebelled against Assyria and turned back the Assyrian assault. We see that in chapter 18 of 2 Kings, and I'm going to read verses 1, 3, and 7, just to get there a little quicker than reading all 7 verses. Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel. That's while the northern kingdom still existed. This was before their defeat and exile. That Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king of Judah, of course. And he, that's Hezekiah, did right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father David had done. So Hezekiah was a good king, as David was a good king. And the Lord was with him. Yahweh was supporting Hezekiah. Wherever he went, he prospered. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. However, that didn't last long. He was worried about the new king of Assyria, and he wanted to blunt any confrontation with Assyria. So he eventually ended up paying tribute to Sennacherib, who was the new king of Assyria. That's Sennacherib. We read about that in 2 Kings 18. I'm going to read verses 13, 14, and 15. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I've done wrong. That's Hezekiah speaking. I've done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. He said, I'll pay you tribute. So the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. I haven't checked out to see how much that is, but that's a pretty good chunk of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver which was found in the house of the Lord. In other words, he took all the silver out of the temple and in the treasures of the king's house. So he took all the silver he could find and gave it to Sennacherib. But that didn't stop the tension. Sennacherib was determined to conquer and destroy Judah and Jerusalem, just as his predecessor, whose name, by the way, if you're into these things, is Shalmaneser, Shalmaneser. Everything that Shalmaneser had done to Samaria. He wanted to duplicate that exile of Judah and replacement with foreign peoples. During this confrontation, Assyria's leaders approached the wall at Jerusalem. They had taken the fortified cities around the nation, but they approached now the walls of Jerusalem. And they spoke directly to the people. They were really arrogant. They were insulting Yahweh in the process. The purpose, of course, was to encourage surrender through ridicule and intimidation. I'm going to read now verses 28 through 32 of 2 Kings chapter 18. Then Rabshakeh, that's the Syrian officer, stood by the wall in Jerusalem and cried with a loud voice in Judean, using their language, saying, Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king of Assyria, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he, Hezekiah, will not be able to deliver you from my hand. He said, I'm going to take you. Verse 3, nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and his city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. He said, don't let Hezekiah say that to you and get by with it. Verse 31, do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me, and each of his vine and each of his fig tree, and drink of the waters of his own cistern. So what's he saying? You come out with me, you surrender to me, things will stay cool. You will still stay with a certain amount of prosperity and peace. Verse 32, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. He said, when I transplant you, you will like it. You will live. You won't die. But, and here's the caution again, do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, Yahweh will deliver us. So what did Hezekiah do? Looking for some help. The 2 Kings, we're jumping now to chapter 19, verse 12. And when King Hezekiah heard what this guy had been saying at the wall, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and entered the house of the Lord. He went into the temple to pray. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, that's the household of Hezekiah, with Shebna the scribe and the elders of the priests covered with sackcloth, sent them to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos. So, where was Hezekiah looking for help? He was looking for help from God. He went then and sent for a man of God that he knew about, the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah prayed. God answered with an encouraging word for Judah. Yahweh had plans beyond the Assyrian plans. Going now in chapter 19 to verses 32 and 33, let's hear God's side of this. Therefore, thus says Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come to this city or shoot an arrow there. He's talking about Jerusalem. Neither shall he come before it with a shield and throw up a mound against it. That's for going over the wall and invading, of course. By the way that he came, the same way that he came, by the same way he shall return, and he shall not come to this city, Jerusalem, declares Yahweh. So, what happens? Yahweh sends Malach Yahweh as his response. And looking at verses 35 and 36 in 2 Kings 19 right now. Then it appeared that night, that same night that Isaiah and Hezekiah prayed, then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord, there's Malach Yahweh, went out and listened to what he did. He struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians, and when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of those 185,000 were dead. So Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. So this king says, uh-oh, 185,000 of his troops decimated in one night. By whom? By Malach Yahweh. You think God is wimpy? He's loving. He cannot use violence. You better get over it, because here's a perfect example that his wrath can result in violence. Yahweh the sender and Malach Yahweh the agent are two people here, notice. One is one sent. The one sent and the sender are separate personalities. This is not the Christian's typical picture of God. God is a God of love. But people forget, or tend to forget, that he has other attributes such as justice, wrath, righteousness, holiness. God deals with enemies on his own terms, but his terms are always just, always righteousness, always righteous. Sometimes those terms take the form of warfare or some other calamity. Sometimes it's called evil. It's not evil in the sense in which we typically think of it, but it's a calamity or it's a slaughter and warfare. Remember, they killed many Canaanites to get this land. So God is not afraid to take life of opponents. This action of killing the 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, that's not the only instance of harsh action that's taken by Malach Yahweh, and he does it to protect his people and mete out God's justice. And now Isaiah spoke of the same event in much the same words you will find in some of 2 Kings. I think it's probably chapter 18 that we didn't finish reading, but we'll get the same words here. It's in Isaiah chapter 37, verses 35, 36, and 37. This is Yahweh speaking. I will defend this city and save it. And Isaiah is speaking about this instance, by the way. For why will I save Jerusalem? That's the question one might ask. For my sake is God's response. For the sake of David, my servant. He said, I'm doing it for my own reasons. They are just, they are right, but they are violent. Verse 36, then the angel of Yahweh, Malach Yahweh, went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. So Isaiah is agreeing with what is in 2 Kings. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. Verse 37, so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. We'll talk about that in a second. Well, might as well do it now. Sennacherib stayed there for his life, but it was rather short because when he returned to Assyria, he was assassinated by two men. But stop and think about it. If Malach Yahweh was the commander of the Lord's host, and remember we introduced this back in Joshua, and the Malach Yahweh as the commander of the Lord's host standing before Joshua between him and Jericho with a sword drawn. This event shouldn't surprise us that he now would go in active battle on behalf of Jerusalem. He said, Sennacherib ain't going to get it. So what do we take away? Well, we have a godly king and a prophet, both of whom prayed, and an invading king was defeated, not by the action of an army from Jerusalem, but it came during one night when Malach Yahweh killed 185,000 foreign invading troops in protection of Jerusalem. God delivered Judah without the help of any man. Yahweh and Malach Yahweh were seen as two personalities, two beings. The power of Malach Yahweh seems above even the power of a normal angel. We think of angels as being superior in strength. Well, Malach Yahweh dealt out 185,000 deaths in one night. Malach Yahweh was Yahweh's answer to the pending crisis. So what's next? How about one more Old Testament prophet? A prophet by the name of Zechariah. We'll look for you then.